Good afternoon, dear friends. Welcome to our weekly Parsha. Now it's not Parsha, Bible or Tanakh discussion. Last week we started a new book, the book of Samuel, and we were introduced to the wondrous story of the birth of Samuel. Of course, Samuel's mother struggles with fertility for many years, and it's only after great heartbreak, anguish, and deep prayer to the point where she's even accused of being a shikar, of being intoxicated, but also ultimately clarifying that that is not the case, where she's blessed and privileged to have a child, a special little boy, who's going to be one of the most important folks, one of the most important figures in Jewish history. He is involved in some of the most pivotal moments for the people of Israel in their land of Israel. He sets up the monarchy, but now he's a young boy. And we closed yesterday's discussion out reading a beautiful song, a poem, a prayer that Hannah, Samuel's mother, sings in gratitude to Hashem, to God, for the gift of a child, as well as bringing attention to the circle of life, the wheel of fortune, and a reminder to be humble when we're on top, to be hopeful when we're on the bottom, and to realize that ultimately Hashem, God, is at the wheel. And that's really the very, very short summary of her song of gratitude to God for providing her prayer. And then we closed off to emphasize that she was very seriously committed to her son being inducted into communal service and to be part of the temple. And so today we're going to get a little bit of a picture of the complicated terrain, the complicated dynamics of the temple management, as well as a big problem. And the Bible, the book of Samuel, doesn't hide it. We underscore it. We bring it to we bring the scandal to our attention. And so let's take a look. Here we are. The screen is shared. And let me just change the layout to be like that. And I gotta zip back a bit. So chapter 2 of the book of Samuel, and by the way, it gets a little confusing. If you look here on top, I just want to draw your attention. It's called 1 Samuel 2, because there is 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. In Hebrew, Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. So this is the first volume of Samuel, chapter 2. And we're now going to be on verse 11 of chapter 2 in Samuel. Hannah finishes her song of praise. Then Elkanah and Hannah go home to their home in Ramah. And the boy entered the service of the Lord under the great, wise, and elderly priest called Eli or Eli. In Hebrew, it's actually Eli. But this, I believe, is the first person to have just the name Eli. In Israeli society, it is not uncommon to hear of a person to carry the name Eli. I have a good friend in our shul, in our synagogue, called Eli. But most Elis that are men's names are actually a nickname for 2 Hebrew names. Eli.
A rabbi.
Yes.
Did they say how old this boy is?
He's quite young. Quite young.
Young. Okay.
Certainly not out of elementary school. Possibly even, he's a real young boy. And again, in today's world, you would never bring a little boy and put him into this kind of environment. But that again, a different time, a different place, and a unique situation. Now, Eli or Eli, I was saying the name Eli or Eli is usually a shortening. It's a nickname for Elijah, Eliyahu, or Eliezer, Eli, or Elimelech. 3 different Hebrew names, each that start off with the name Eli. But here his name was actually Eli. It's a nuance that's more prominent in Hebrew than in English. So his name was Eli. Eli. And he was the high priest. Now there's a problem. Because are you familiar with nepotism? Yes. Where a certain role something would stay in the family. Now sometimes it makes sense. For example, Lynn, you worked with Ron. Right. But that made sense. You were a couple. and you were together when Ron was starting out with nothing in his garage,
Right.
and then it only made sense that you should continue with him, as thank God he he did very well in his saving people's lives and in his creations, in his how do you call it?
Inventions, yes.
In his inventions. That's the word I wanted to say. So that's good family connections. But sometimes, especially in public affairs, in leadership,
That's
a
right.
child does inherit a father's position. I must confess, my father started the shul, and he asked me to come assist him, and I ended up carrying the honor and the burden, the responsibilities and the privileges of being a rabbi here. But sometimes parents bring children into a leadership role, and the children are not suited for the role, or the children do not have the values or the idealistic intentions, and then that could be a very big problem. As a matter of fact, in American politics, there is an occasional tendency to have dynasties, right? So you'll have George H.W. Bush and then his son George W. Bush. But generally speaking, American society is wary of dynasties. That's something that belongs in a monarchy, and we tend to be very wary of a dynasty, where children, just by virtue of relationship to the parents, belong in politics, let's say. And again, I didn't mean to single out a specific comment. That's just the one that came to mind. That's the most recent, and father to son. And so here, Eli is a priest. Now, I want to point out the priesthood was a family affair, in that the priests were from a certain family in the Jewish people, in the children of Israel. But that doesn't mean it always worked, and it doesn't mean it always worked well. And sometimes things needed to be corrected, repaired, and people needed to be removed. And here we're going to see an instance of Eli's children who are not like his father. It was a crisis, and ultimately God intervenes, as we'll see. Now, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. They were no good.
No goodness.
No goodness. They abused their position in a terrible way. Now let's take a look how they abused their position. Now I want to point out, we read in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Parsha, that the priests were entitled to certain gifts from the people. But there is a very important distinction. Who initiates that giving process? It was always the Israelite choosing, to gift an item. It was never about the priests seizing, demanding, or taking gifts. This is how the priests used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling. He would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the cooking pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it. This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there. So the priests would really seize whatever they wanted. These two boys, they would seize items from the Israelites who were coming to the temple. Even before, and this is a word that I don't ever find myself using in English, but it's a reference to a certain portion of the offering that needed to be burnt. The priest would still demand to hand over meat to roast for the priests. He wouldn't accept boiled meat, only raw meat. So basically, there's a certain moment within the cooking process where the Israelite might choose to send a gift over to the priests. And here the priest would send somebody over to demand. This is more like a mob arrangement than a dignified temple priest arrangement. And if the man would say, hey, we got to follow the rules of God, of the Bible, let's first turn the sweat into smoke and then take as much as you want, he'd say, no, we want it now or we'll seize it. A forceful mob-like behavior. This is terrible, because if there's any place where you'd expect proper behavior, manners, gratitude, and allowing the visiting Israelites to initiate how and if and when they give the gift, here they acted very much the opposite. Bullying, demanding, more like a mob than a honorable arrangement. And the sin of the young men against the Lord was very great. For the men treated the Lord's offerings impetuously. They didn't respect the offerings. They treated it like their own little playground, their own place to abuse, to demand, to seize, not what we want to hear, not what we want to see. And this is very disappointing. And there's something particularly disappointing when a person who claims to represent religion or God, and when they abuse their power, it's even more disappointing than when a regular person messes up. Because if you're claiming to speak for religion, for God, for authority, you'd better make triple effort, be triple certain that you're serving in an honorable way. Because when a person speaks in the name of religion and then abuses it, it is the greatest abuse of power. It is the greatest disappointment. And it ultimately hurts people's ability to connect to that religion and to feel connected to God. And that's why this is such a crime. It's an outcry, and they do not escape criticism in the Bible itself. Now, you have to understand, this is an environment where young Samuel is coming of age. Samuel is not part of the crime. He's not part of the mob syndicate. But we could imagine that seeing this disgusting behavior must have been an important, informative thing to be aware of as a young boy. And it must have informed how he saw leadership and how he understood ideal, appropriate behavior versus inappropriate behavior. And so sometimes seeing bad behavior can cause a person to act poorly, but sometimes it can actually inspire a person to act more appropriately. Now, I need one. Give me a second. I just need to answer this. 1 second. Sorry, there's just someone that has some medical issues and they kept on calling, so I just wanted to make sure there's no emergency. Give me 1 more second. Sorry about that, folks. Everything's okay.
That's good.
All right. So the young men sinned against the Lord greatly because they treated the Lord's offerings impiously. Samuel, meanwhile, was engaged in the service of the Lord as an attendant, girded with a linen ephod. So again, this juxtaposition is not to allege Samuel's involvement in this arrangement, not at all. It's just to create the backdrop and the environment in which Samuel lives and is coming of age. Samuel, of course, is devoted not to the sons, but to the father. So Samuel was in the temple as an attendant. He was a Levite, and he's wearing a linen ephod. What is an ephod? So an ephod is usually translated as a kind of apron. It was a ceremonial, ritual kind of apron, typically worn by those who were officiating in the temple. What else would he wear? What do you wear in the times of the Bible? Pretty primitive times. His mother would also make a little robe for him and bring it up to him every year. So every year when his mom would visit him, she'd bring him a knitted sweater. No, she would bring him a robe when she made a pilgrimage with her husband to offer the annual sacrifices. So maybe this is the origin of holiday knitted gifts. Samuel would get a robe from his mother. And Eli, the high priest, would bless this power couple, Elkanah and his wife, Samuel's parents, and say, "May the Lord grant you offspring by this woman in place of the loan she made to the Lord." So Eli's like, wow, your son is so amazing. He's so important and so integral to the temple function. God should give you more of such children.
Right.
That's the blessing he gave. And guess what? The Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Young Samuel, meanwhile, grows up in the service of the Lord. So it sounds like Hannah has 4 boys and 2 girls, right? Because 3, I
Yeah.
think this is 3 additional boys. I believe so. Let's look at some of the let me just give me a second. Let's take a look here. Now, Samuel's brothers were lucky in that they grew up in a home. They didn't grow up in the temple. They lived at home. But Samuel is lucky because this allows him ultimately to develop as a very prominent, spiritually important, and politically important individual. And so, you contrast in life, everyone has a different experience. Everyone has a different place in the world, but ultimately everybody finds their place and their role. Now let's go. So let's just back up for a moment. I've done a lot of talking. I want to summarize and I want to hear your opinions. We read about how this young boy lives in the temple. We've talked of the corruption of the younger priests, the sons of the high priest, the way they would, behind their father's back, abuse the pilgrims, the folks that were coming to the temple out of devotion to God, their seizing, their theft, their abuse. And it gets worse, as we'll see soon. And it's in this environment where Samuel is innocently living alongside the elder high priest in attendance. And then we read that Hannah has additional children. Lynn, go ahead.
Okay, but I just started to read now, but you kind of answered my question. In other words, Eli didn't know what his sons were doing. Is that the truth? He really didn't know?
We're going to see soon. He's informed. It seems like he wasn't entirely aware, but it seems like he was also, easing out with his, he was becoming more feeble. And so he was less present. And his absence created a vacuum that allows these kids to act on their.
But you would think that somebody would have told him what was going on with his kids.
So we'll see. A lot of times people, Lynn, you're asking a great question. And it's a question I wonder a lot of times, because, we hear about different abuses in Hollywood and in schools and even in clergy. And we wonder, why didn't somebody
come and tell the parents?
The first time it happened and the second time it happened, why didn't anybody say something? And it usually takes one brave person to speak up. And then all of a sudden we find out that there are many other people that were also, and I don't know the answer to it. It's one of the great painful, it's a painful aspect of human existence where many people are willing to turn a blind eye, even to their own abuse, out of the shame of coming forward. And it usually takes, and we're going to see here. So that's not an answer. It's a complaint that I have. It's a complaint that we share, because why can't we deal with issues? And usually what happens is if there's an isolated report, the person says, oh, it only happened here. Maybe I didn't exactly perceive it. And there's mind games that happen, unfortunately, to people who are victims. And that's why it's so important to support and respect and be open to people that are victimized, because many times the person that's abused is inclined to be afraid to come forward. And so let's see what happens. But your question is a good one. I don't have the answer to it. It's one of those eternal matters of disappointment, shall we say. Whoa. All right. Now, Eli was very old. I don't know if this means age, or more likely it's describing he's becoming a little more feeble, less active, less engaged, when he heard all that his sons were doing to all of Israel, and how they lay with the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So it sounds like their abuse started with theft and rapidly expanded to abuse in a much more severe, extreme, and unacceptable manner. Now, I want to tell you something. The Talmud actually debates what exactly they did, because the wording in the Hebrew is a little ambiguous.
What were the tasks that these women were doing at the entrance of the tent meeting?
Well, people are coming to the temple to bring offerings, to pray, and it sounds like they're molesting these women.
Yeah, but what were the women doing? Were they?
They're coming in a devotional way to pay tribute and there's this abusive dynamic. That's clear. But I want to give you the defense, if you will, not defense that this is acceptable, but an alternate interpretation which is not present in the translation. The one way to read it is that they literally were molesting, abusing, and being immoral with ostensibly married women. It doesn't indicate if it was consensual or not, but it doesn't matter because, first of all, if you're a priest, you're supposed to be representing the Lord. Well, you're the higher bar, the higher demands are on you. And so, again, there's no indication that it was or wasn't consensual, but regardless, this is considered spiritually abhorrent. It is an abuse of power. However, I want to give you an alternate explanation to this passage. In the temple times, after a person had a child, they would bring an offering of thanksgiving to God. And many couples would abstain from intimacy. Today, there's the doctors will tell a person that has given child, had a child, has given birth, how long they should abstain from, from sexual or marital activities. But in those days, the Bible provided that a person should bring a thanksgiving offering. And many folks would abstain from marital relations until they brought that offering. And the Talmud says that these priests would interfere, abuse, and prolong the different offerings, thus interfering with their marital life by delaying their ability or their ability to resume common marital relations with their spouses. So either way, there's an abuse of power. Depending on how you define it, it was either bad or terrible. But either way, it was unacceptable. Their behavior was unacceptable.
Right.
And so he says to them, so Eli hears about it, and he calls over his boys and says, why are you doing such a thing? I'm getting evil reports about you from people everywhere. It's, one time I say, maybe they have something against you. Maybe they're exaggerating, but this is just out of hand. And then he says, don't, my sons, don't do this. It's not a favorable report I hear from the people of the Lord spreading about. This isn't good. And this doesn't represent God, the temple, Judaism. This doesn't represent well. And then he says a very powerful line. If a man sins against a man, which I believe means if a person just does a regular interpersonal, a regular thing, well, then God could pardon you. But if you are sinning in representation of the Lord, that's how I'm going to define this, then how can you be forgiven? You do something as a private individual, that's one thing. But if you do it as a representative of the Lord, how can you be forgiven? They ignore their father's plea, and their evil is so extensive that the Lord was resolved that they should die. So they're going to be punished.
Okay.
And so suffice it to say, here is the story. They're abusing their power. It seems like they do it with more and more impunity. Eventually, their father hears about it. He calls them in. He tells them, you guys better cut it out. But he didn't have the influence and he didn't have the strength and the ability to himself enforce it. And so he tells them to cut it out, to shape up. They don't listen. And ultimately, Hashem, God, gets involved. And it is destined that they are going to die a young death because of their abuse of power and their misdeeds. And then the Bible continues, yet Samuel, meanwhile, grew in esteem and favor, both with God, with men. So you have three people that are the primary machers in the temple. Eli's two sons, troublemakers. God's mad at them. The people are mad at them because they're seizing stuff. They're molesting the people that want to come and pray. And then you have Samuel, who's doing things right. And all of a sudden, the people are finding favor in him. God is happy with him. He's the only shining, he's the only, what's the word?
Shining
in a terrible
star.
he's
star.
A shining star in a pretty disappointing and bad situation. And so meanwhile, so this, you might wonder, why are we talking about the sons of Eli and then Samuel and back and forth? But again, I think it's a poetic way to really convey to us the contrast between the different characters, the really righteous Samuel versus the very depraved and evil sons of Eli. Here's the end of the story. A man of God came to Eli, a priest. Who is the identity of this man of God? The Bible doesn't say, but we can speculate. Maybe it was Elijah. Not Elijah, but Pinchas, who was an old man and a prophet who seems to have been on the periphery throughout. It might have also been another prophet. We don't know. What we do know is that he has a message from the Lord, a prophecy. He comes to Eli and says to him, "Thus said the Lord." And so he doesn't just say, "Hey, your kids are making trouble. They're going to be in trouble." We get a little bit of a background, similar to some of the prophetic messages the Jewish people got in the book of prophets. The book of Judges. Thus said the Lord, "Lo, behold, I revealed myself to your father's house in Egypt when they were subjects, slaves to Pharaoh. I chose them from all the tribes to be my priests, to ascend my altar, to burn the incense, carry my ephod before me." What the prophet is saying is all the Jews were slaves. The Levites and the priests were chosen.
That's right.
I assigned to your house all offerings by fire of the Israelites, and the priests particularly receive this honor. Why then do you maliciously trample upon the sacrifices and offerings that I have commanded? I gave you this gift. I gave you the opportunity to lead. Why are you abusing it? You have honored your sons more than me, feeding on the first portion of every offering of my people Israel. So the prophet here, although Eli didn't do anything wrong,
Right.
and even though he did confront his sons, the prophet says God's upset. You protested, but you didn't get them to stop. And so long as it persists, that is a problem. Assuredly, declared the Lord, God of Israel, I intended for you and your father's house to remain in my service forever. God is telling through the prophet Eli, your family could have been a dynasty of high priests, of leaders for all time. But now declares the Lord, far be it from me. But God says, I've changed my mind. For I honor those who honor me, but those who spurn me shall be dishonored. Your family is going. So it's not Eli, but it's his family who's going to lose their position.
Yeah.
A time is coming.
And Eli, or just the children?
Well, Eli's old, so he's at the end of his career.
Okay.
But Eli would have loved to see the thing that he was most passionate about, honoring the temple, continue in his family. And God is saying, listen, your boys didn't stop, and therefore this role is going to stop. Right. A time is coming when I will break your power and that of your father's house. There shall be no elder in your house. This is a devastating curse. What Eli is being told is that his descendants will not reach an old age. Oh. They're being punished to die young. You will gaze grudgingly at all the bounty that will be bestowed on Israel, but there shall never be an elder in your house. So this family is being cursed. It's very sad. And
the wife too?
Well, it's the children. Eli's old already. Ostensibly, the wife is old too. But the children,
old. All right, yeah.
But the children and their progeny are going to suffer. Right. I shall not cut all your offsprings from the altar to make your eyes pine, your spirit languish. All the increase in your household shall die as ordinary men. But what's going to happen is, so he's saying your family line is not going to be destroyed, but you're going to lose authority, and your family is going to have some poor genes. That's a very sad curse. And this shall be a sign for you. Remember, a priest is talking to him. This is the sign. The fate of your two sons, Hophni and Pinchas, they'll die on the same day. So God is telling, the prophet is telling Eli, your sons misbehaved. I wish that your family should have a dynasty. Your sons did not repent, they did not mend their ways. You weren't able to rein them in. Your family's losing the authority. There's going to be a hereditary challenge with old age, and you're gonna regret and miss your glory days, your family's glory days as the high priest. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. So Eli wasn't the only priest. There are other families of priests who will act in accordance to my wishes and purposes. I'll build for him an enduring house, and he shall walk before my anointed evermore. So God is really, these are tough words, Tough words for anyone to hear. Tough words for a man who's been devoted all his life, but he can't inspire his sons to join him in this devotion.
Sad.
It's very sad.
Mhm.
And all the survivors of your house shall come, bow low to him for the sake of a money fee. You're going to have to. So God is saying, the prophet is saying more than that. You're going to be replaced. And the person who takes your place is going to wield all the power, and your descendants are going to have to come and kind of plead their case for a money fee, for a loaf of bread, and say, please, assign me to one of the priestly duties that I may have a morsel of bread to eat. So they're going to have to beg to be employed in the temple.
Whoa.
And so this is a tragic, sad ending. And Eli is being treated roughly, not because he did anything wrong, but because his children couldn't
Yeah,
continue.
but he didn't control his children.
He couldn't control his children.
No,
Now, it's not.
But he didn't control his children. So
He didn't. If he could
Right.
or he couldn't is hard to know,
Well,
hard to say.
that's
But he
right.
didn't. He
That's
didn't.
right.
And that's
So he's
unfortunate.
getting it too because his children weren't controlled. Yeah.
Yeah. And listen,
Mhm.
there's nothing. It's a very painful turn of events. But this ends up being, in a sense, Samuel's big break, because Samuel's not going to become a priest, but he is going to fill the leadership void. That's clear.
Mhm.
Now, I want to tell you something interesting. In the Talmud, so the Talmud is a text that doesn't come into existence for more than 1,000 years after this point, because this is the beginning of the biblical, or the middle of the biblical period. The Talmud is written well a 1,000 years after this or more. But the Talmud records that there were two great scholars who were both Kohanes, both priests. One was called Abaya, and the other was called Rava. And they both passed away at a relatively young age, and they associated their mortality with being descendants of this priest, Eli. And so it seems like there was a family tradition, folks, 1,000 years later, that connected and traced back their heritage to these priests. They were an honorable family, great scholars, but unfortunately, there was a genetic propensity to, different illnesses that caused them not all to live a long age, and they associated it with this passage of the book of Samuel. So again, this is a sad story, but it's a necessary. We need the contrast. We need to see the fullness of the picture. We need to be able to celebrate the wins, appreciate the strength, but also appreciate the concurrent human weakness, and that's what's happening in this chapter in this story. But I don't want to end off on a low note, and so we're going to go to the next chapter, and we're going to see some good stuff too.
Good.
So yeah, we don't want to end off on a low and disappointing note.
Right.
So as the house of Eli's family is being eclipsed, it's coming to a close. Young Samuel, chapter 3, verse 1. Young Samuel was in the service of the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Prophecy was not widespread. There weren't a lot of prophets.
Mhm.
One day, Eli was asleep in his place. His eyes had begun to fail and he could barely see. So again, we see age is creeping up on him.
He's failing.
He's visually impaired. And remember, today, thankfully, we have a lot of, a person's sight fails. Well, there's glasses, there's lenses, there's laser, surgery, there's cataract surgery. And vision, what it does for us, doesn't just allow us to see, but it keeps us fresh and aware and vibrant. And this is a great gift that we have today. But in those days, they didn't have that. So a person's eyes fail. They begin to find themselves less relating to the folks around them, and they begin to withdraw. And it's reality, but it's tragic. And that's the picture that's being painted here. The lamp of the Lord had not yet gone out. Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord, where the ark was, and so Samuel now is sleeping in the tabernacle. Excuse me. At a later point, it wouldn't be quite likely to find the people that are managing the temple to be sleeping like that. But here we have to understand, it seems like the temple is pretty abandoned. There's not a lot of folks that are devoted to the temple. And so there are the few staff, the bare bones staff, they're all there. And Samuel is sleeping in the temple, not far from where the ark of the Lord was. And here is Samuel's big moment. Big moment. The Lord called to Samuel. The Lord called to Samuel, and he says, I'm coming, which is actually not the right translation. He should have said, here I am. Samuel hears a voice, and he doesn't say, yes, God, because he doesn't know it's God talking to him. He's hearing a voice, and he's thinking that it's Eli, his boss, and says, I'm coming, don't worry, because he's an attendant to the elderly, feeble high priest. So he ran to Eli and says, I'm here, you called me. But Eli in his sleep says, I didn't call you, go back to sleep, you're hearing things. So he went back and lay down. And again, the Lord called Samuel. Samuel rose and again goes to Eli and it says, here I am, you called me. And the old sleeping priest says, no, I didn't call you, go back to sleep. Now Samuel had not yet experienced the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. He never experienced a prophetic communication. And so he didn't know what was happening. Kind of like, remember when Manoah's wife meets an angel and she doesn't know what's going on? Was it a man? Was it an angel? The Lord called Samuel a third time. He rose, went to Eli. He says, here I am, you called me. Then Eli understood. The Lord was calling the boy. This young boy is moving on to something very special. Prophecy, divine interaction, engagement, something that doesn't happen to anyone. But young Samuel is being called with prophecy. Again, the whole idea of prophetic hearing a prophecy, the word of the Lord, is something that we quite frankly don't relate to because there is no such thing as prophecy today. But once upon a time, according to the Bible, according to the Jewish tradition, God chose to communicate or interact with human beings in a way that, for whatever reason, today we don't experience. And so now Eli says to Samuel, he realizes that something's going on. So Eli tells the young boy that he is mentoring, go lay down. If you're called again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And Lord here means the word for God, God's name. Speak, Hashem, for your servant is listening. Samuel went to his place and lied down. Could you imagine trying to sleep after thinking maybe God's trying to talk to you?
Oh God, no.
He must have been freaked out. He must have been really. The Lord came and stood there. God doesn't have a physical body, but there's this presence. And he called as before, Samuel, Samuel. And now Samuel knows, and he says, speak, your Lord. Speak, my Lord, for your servant is listening.
So
the Lord said to Samuel,
it was the older man, the father, who realized that God was talking to him. Okay.
Not the father, but the mentor.
The mentor. I'm sorry, I meant the mentor.
The high priest realizes something's going on. It's not, if it's not me and there's nobody else in the temple, and it sounds like God.
Right.
Now, I know what you're thinking because it's what I'm thinking. Do you think God's voice sounds just like somebody else's voice? Does God have a voice? And so without getting too deeply into the deep mystical and philosophical concepts of prophecy and how a God might choose or how God might choose to speak to human beings, suffice it to say the mechanism of prophecy was a way for God to communicate with humans. God doesn't have a voice.
Right.
God can choose to create and project a communication to a human being by using a voice. But that's God doing that's like God doesn't exist in a physical sense of existence, but he could create a world. So the God that can create the universe can also generate a sound that will create this sense of an intimacy and a communication between a human and his creator, but not because God has a specific voice, because voice comes from a physical, vocal cords and a physical existence. So God has the ability to create communication to human beings, but not because God has a voice. But God is creating something that is relatable to the human being. And so young Samuel is going to be inducted into a role of conveying divine messages. So God is creating a sound that's going to be palatable to a human being. But this is, again, not to say that God has a certain voice. God chose a comforting and familiar voice. And let's think about it. What sound does God choose for Samuel to hear? A voice that's not unlike that of his mentor. so that it doesn't freak him out, so that he's able to ease him into it. And that's pretty profound, that God is choosing him for this role and easing him into it. So I think that's an important, point to add over here. And so now Samuel says, "Speak, my Lord." The Lord says to Samuel, God says, "I'm going to do to Israel such a thing that the ears of anyone who hear about it will tingle. Something that's going to be utterly shocking."
Mm-hmm.
"In that day, I'll fulfill against Eli all that I spoke about his house from beginning to end." So Samuel is getting a communication from God, and part of it is not exactly flattering or wonderful for his boss.
Right.
Something's going to happen, and my prophecy against the house of Eli is going to come to be fulfilled. And I declare to him that I sentence his house to endless punishment for the iniquity he knew about, how his sons committed sacrilege at will, and he did not sufficiently rebuke them. Therefore, I swore about the house of Eli that the iniquity of the house of Eli will never be expiated by sacrifice or offering. God says they're not going to be able to wiggle their way out of this consequence. Samuel lay there until the morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, which must have been his job. And Samuel was afraid to report the vision to Eli. How is this young boy going to tell his mentor that God told him that he's going to do in his boss, his mentor?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so Eli summons Samuel, and he says, "Samuel, my son." And he says, "Yes, here." Eli said, "What did he say to you? What did God say?" "Keep nothing from me. Thus and more may God do to you if you keep from me a single word of all that he said to you." It's not going to be good. You got to tell me.
This whole thing isn't good.
You got to. He says, "I know." Eli says, "I know you don't want to share with me what you heard because it ain't positive, but you got to share with me." He said, "You better tell me." What did he mean when he said "thus and more"? So Rashi, who's one of the commentaries, says, Eli saying, if you don't communicate with me, well, you'll have the same nachas that I'm having for my kids. You're gonna also struggle with your kids. So basically, don't hide. He's saying, don't sugarcoat.
My mother used to say that.
Don't sugarcoat things, or you'll have the same nachas you're giving. And so Samuel told him everything, held nothing from him. And Eli said, and this is powerful, this is the sign of a righteous, special person. He is the Lord. He will do what he deems right. Eli must have been devastated, but he accepted it. God is the Lord. He can do whatever he wants, and he accepts it. And so, again, in a time where we're somewhat disappointed with the character of Eli, we also get to see his noble side, his dignified side, his godly side. He's upset. He's disappointed. But that's what happens. And he accepted it. And so I think it's wonderful that the Bible, that the Torah, that the Bible, that the book of Samuel includes this detail, because I think it allows us to emerge with a deepened respect for this Eli, who has the misfortune of not having the nachas he'd hoped for, and yet he accepts it. What could he do? And now we're going to close out this chapter with two more verses. Samuel grew up. The Lord was with him. He did not leave any of Samuel's predictions unfulfilled. Samuel becomes a full-fledged prophet who has communications, divine communications, and they were always proven to be accurate and true. And because of that, all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was trustworthy as a prophet of the Lord.
Very good.
So he has a reputation. So this was the story of Samuel's coming to age. He grows up in a complicated situation where he is an attendant to the high priest, who's very righteous. Two sons are corrupt, abusive, and if not worse. And he has his first prophecy as a young man. And that prophecy isn't flattering to his mentor. He shares it with his mentor. And ultimately, out of this complicated situation, he emerges a rising star. That's our hero, Samuel.
Mhm.
This is the book of Samuel. Why don't we finish right over here? And then actually, no, let's do one more verse because then we're going to finish chapter 4. And the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh. The Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh with the word of the Lord. And so basically, Samuel becomes a full-fledged prophet and almost a prophet like no other.
Mhm.
And
Very good story. Mhm.
that's our hero. And so today,
Yeah.
as I warned you, a complicated story, but ultimately from all of the friction, all of the pain emerges Samuel in a very special and beautiful way.
Very nice.
That, my dear friends, concludes chapter 2 and 3, book of Samuel. Next week, God willing, we'll study again and we'll read chapter 4. We'll discuss and that's the story.
Very
I wish
good.
everyone a
story,
wonderful,
Rabbi.
healthy,
Very
and
good.
safe. So I told you we're going to go. The book of Joshua was interesting. There was a lot of geography and battle. The book of Judges was complicated, a lot of drama. But the book of Samuel is a real a novel. But it's not a novel. It's the Bible. It's telling us timeless, important lessons
That's right.
about our people, how God interacts with the world, and we'll continue.
Okay,
So,
Rabbi.
folks, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. This was
Sei
good.
gesund. Stay healthy and well, and I'm excited to see everyone.
Stay
God
well.
willing.
Have a happy New
Okay.
Year.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll
Happy New Year. Yes.
we'll see you all on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Too
I
bad
should
the
have said.
sons. It's too bad the sons didn't take after Samuel, though.
Yeah.
Not much knockers for them.
So, folks, see you next year.
Yeah.
Yes.
See you
Be
next
well. Be well.
Bye. Be well,
Shalom.
everybody.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yes.
all.
Happy New
Bye.
Year, Lynn and Shara, Joy. Bye bye.